Can confirm.
10 out of 10 would not recommend road tripping with me as a sick person. And I just started to cry because I didn't want to lose my career.
And at that moment, it was like, oh, this is for real.
And you said, I'm going to ask you to do something that I am not sure I myself could do. I have not enjoyed this birth. And we pushed, and we pushed, and we pushed. I was like, you might as well sell tickets at this point.
In reality, it's one of the most present moments I can remember in my life.
If I'd had that transfusion, my recovery would have been significantly faster. I started this because I developed a pelvic organ prolapse that was news to me, very scary and all of that. And to kind of understand how I got there, you need to know a little bit more of my history. And this is probably the very first, very big pinnacle aspect of that history. And who better than to help me tell the story than my ride or die best friend, partner in crime, my husband, Keith.
Hello.
So we're going to talk through a couple of questions that we learned to ask in very big medical situations to start applying those, but we're going to use this medical trauma to share that with you. Like, that feels like a really big setup, don't you think?
Right. Medical trauma. Dum, dum, dum.
Which in reality was just the pregnancy and birth of our first child. But it was a big medical trauma.
Yeah, absolutely.
So getting pregnant wasn't the easiest thing for us. But once we were pregnant, I was sick really fast. We had a big trip the day that we found out we were pregnant. A big long road trip. I was sick. We weren't telling anybody. And so it's just like, oh, just car sick. Like, just trying to brush it off.
We just have the flu.
And then had to tell people earlier because I was significantly sicker and growing sicker by the time. So at Christmas time, we had to tell people like, oh, by the way, we're 7 weeks pregnant. Then we went to my brother's wedding, which was an even bigger road trip. And at that point in time, I was so sick that I was on average throwing up about every 40 minutes for that entire 3-day trip. It was terrible because I am not a quiet, sick person. The joke in my family is that you could be in the furthest reaches of the house and you could still hear me as a sick person. So I'm not a good sick person.
Can confirm.
10 out of 10 would not recommend road tripping with me as a sick person. And coming back from that trip, I had a really hard recovery. I had this fantastic job that I absolutely loved. But I would work 2 days and then be out for 3 days, or work 3 days and then be out for 2 days. And it just was a disaster because I was falling behind. But they were patient with me and they were understanding. And then one of my greatest mentors and friends from that career took me aside. I was probably I had to have been like 10, 11 weeks pregnant. 10.
At most.
Yeah, maybe 10 weeks pregnant. And she just looked at me and she said, I'm going to take off my boss hat and I'm going to put on my mentor and friend hat. And she just looked at me and she said, it is getting really hard to count on you at work. But even more so than that, this is taking a toll on you. Have you and Keith considered you quitting? And I just started to cry because I didn't want to lose my career. Like, I loved that job. But I also knew that it was a big financial burden for us to do that at the time. And even more so, like, it wouldn't have been 2 weeks' notice. Like, I was afraid that if I left under those circumstances, I wouldn't be able to come back. And I really liked that job. So I was like, if I'm going to quit, I want to be able to come back. And she's like, no, under medical circumstances like this, we'll work everything out with HR. You just talk to Keith. It was a big, big turning point in this pregnancy for us, don't you think?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I remember calling you. What do you remember about that day?
Well, I just remember, in my mind, I was trying to just downplay it. Like, oh, it's okay. It's not that big of a deal. It'll pass. It's going to get better. And at that moment, it was like, oh, this is for real. This is like a real issue. This is a big one. We have to take this a lot more seriously.
And we didn't decide anything right then because you were working. By the way, he's a high school teacher, high school band director. So I had just caught him on his prep. So he's like, well, just go home and rest and we'll talk about it tonight. And I remember because at the time I was still like all the time throwing up. I was like, I had to go through traffic. So I would hang bags on my ears, like grocery bags, and throw up while I was driving. I also had a great big like salad bowl lined with garbage, like grocery bags as well. Like it was awful.
If there's any like police officers or highway patrol or anything watching this, I hope the statute of limitations has worn off or expired or whatever that is.
It was bad. It was really bad. But the thing that was holding me together was I had called the nurses because I was like, should I be throwing up this much? They're like, it's just morning sickness. If you can drink or eat something and hold it down for 20 minutes, you're going to be just fine. And so I was like, okay, well, I usually hold it down for 20 minutes, about that, but that's about all. But then I throw that up and everything else that was more than that. So I was also like soaking in the tub. If I was not laying in bed or on the couch at home, I was in the tub until bedtime. And so I think I remember I was laying in the tub just trying to get rehydrated, like soaking in as much water as I possibly could at the time. And I remember you walked in and you looked at me and you just looked so conflicted and you said, I'm going to ask you to do something that I am not sure I myself could do. And you said, I need you to either go to work every single day, regardless of how you feel or what's going on, or we need to quit. And you said, but this has got to be your decision. And that felt so heavy at that time. What was that like to pose that question?
I mean, put in a word, it sucked. Because I knew how much you loved that job, and like you mentioned a minute ago, it was a financial burden if you quit. All of a sudden, holy cow, how are we going to pay all the bills? And we've got a baby coming, and all these things. But I mean, I knew it was a turning point. And I knew it was one of those things where it was like, okay, no matter what you choose, it's going to change things. It's going to change things between us. It's going to change things for your job. It's going to change how you view yourself in relation to that job. So it was heavy. And I meant what I said. Like, I'm not sure I could have made that decision.
Well, that night I decided I was quitting my job. And I did ask you, I was like, how are we going to do this? And you said, I don't know, but we'll do it.
Yeah, we'll work it out. We'll figure it out.
So the next day I called in. I didn't even drive in. And I just said, I'm going to do it. I'm just going to quit. And I'm so sorry. I know that's rough for you. But they were extremely supportive. And we made it through that. But that really, truly was a turning point because I got sicker and sicker and sicker to the point that we went to the ER. Like I got to a place where I was not even holding it down for 20 minutes at a time.
Yeah, it was bad.
And like I no longer was in pain. Like when you get severely dehydrated,
right,
like everything hurts and like you're just achy all the time. But I was past all of that. And you had a basketball game that night with your pep band. And you were supposed to leave at like 6 a.m. the next morning to get on a 7 a.m. flight to go to San Diego for a conference. Mm-hmm. And I called you and I just said, you have to come home right now. So for like the third time in your career, the first of three, I guess.
The first of a few, for sure.
You handed over the game to an administrator and you came home and you took me to the hospital and they wanted to admit me that night, thinking my kidneys were shutting down. So they called my doctor and we loved her so much because we had inadvertently chosen a high-risk clinic too when I started going to this OBGYN.
Yeah, that's a little miracle in passing, not even in passing, but you were asking around when we moved to that area, yeah, who's the best, who's a good one to go to, and that was the recommendation we got, and she ended up being at this high-risk clinic, which is exactly what we needed.
It was so perfectly what we needed because she didn't panic. Like, she was really straightforward. She laid out the risk, the pros, the cons all the time. But she's just like, hey, we see this all the time. Like, not a big deal. we're going to get through this together. And so she told them, no, she's just extremely dehydrated. Give her 2 liters and have her come see me tomorrow. And then I remember when we went back the next day, they gave me another 2 liters. And then when we finally saw her, she's like, I don't know what's going on with you. She's like, you should be past this already. You're like at week 13. And by this point, I had lost 18% of my body weight in the first 13 weeks of my pregnancy. It was unbelievable because I was wearing jeans that I couldn't wear before I even got pregnant, like jeans that I hadn't worn in years. And here I was 13 weeks pregnant, no baby bump, no nothing, just super sick and looking emaciated.
Yeah, it was crazy.
She's like, but we can't wait to see if you're going to turn a corner. She's like, you might still, but we can't wait anymore. So you need to start home health. So then we had to go through the process of setting up home health. I think by the time we got home, we had the first order was on its way and it was delivered that night.
Yeah, they had a 24-hour delivery service for stuff like that, and it was fast. It was wild too because like it plunged us into this world from, you know, we've talked a little bit about this before, but you have a baby on the way and there's the glow and you're supposed to be happy. And with us, it was like all of a sudden we were in battle mode, you know, like we just got to survive. How the heck do we do this? And all of a sudden we're in this foreign territory. There will be a van arriving at your home at whatever, you know, carrying supplies, and we're going to teach you how to do this, all this stuff. I mean, it was just nuts. I mean, it was surreal.
Then as soon as that box of supplies came, we were supposed to call and set an appointment with the home health nurse. And the instruction was that they were to come that night, regardless of what time it was. So I think our supplies came at 6 and the home health nurse was there at 8. And they started with the peripheral veins in my arms, like elbow and down into my hands. And they set the first one. And she said, these are things you need to be watching for. Here's my personal cell phone number. If at any point in time you notice any of these, you need to call me. And so then she walked us through how to hook up the PICC line, or not the PICC line, but to hook up the IV to the port. I was like, I can't think of the word. The port. And to flush the line and all of that, and got us through our very first IV bag.
Yeah, she was teaching me, like, here's how you clean it. Here's how you hook it up. Here's how you put the vitamins in, you know, all the things. It was weird. It felt like a little nurse in training.
Mini hospital.
Yeah. Oh, career change. Cool.
So we did that. And because of your work schedule, we would have to get up at 4:30 and start the first one. Because if you do it too fast, it can increase the nausea or something. There were like very specific instructions about how fast we could get it going. And so it had to be at a certain drip, and it took about 2 hours to get through an entire bag. So we would get up at 4:30. You would run that first IV, and it was bad. It was so cold. I would just sit and shiver for 2 hours. It's not like I could go back to sleep at that point in time, which meant you're trying to help me stay warm, so you're not sleeping. And then it was right during the end of basketball season and festival season. So then you're getting home at like 9:30 at night. We start the next bag, and then we're up till 11:30, and then we start all over again at 4:30 the next morning. It was a crazy routine. I don't even know how you did it.
We just did it because it's what needed to be done.
To be done.
Yeah.
If we were lucky, like my sister was coming out and hanging out with us because she was in the area, so she would come out and hang out. So we taught her, and so she could help at night, which that took some of the pressure off. But within those first 7 days, I collapsed 6 veins because of severe dehydration. And we just couldn't get enough hydration going to allow for those veins to be viable. So at that point in time, the home health nurse put in my last good vein, she called it, this is the last one, you have to protect it with everything. So like my arm just was like out all the time. That was so ridiculous. And the following Monday, which was President's Day, we went to the infusion clinic where the rad tech, the radiology department, had to place a PICC line, which if you've never dealt with a PICC line, it is like a 3 foot long, 2 foot long, something like that, 2.5 feet, somewhere between 2 and 3 feet long tubing that they will go in, and it's a big procedure because it has to be, they're going straight into a vein that they find with an ultrasound. So you're draped with a shield. They have just a small spot on your arm open that's sanitized and cleaned like a surgical procedure. They cut into the vein that they've located with an ultrasound, and then they thread this big long tube so that it follows the vein all the way up, and then it drops underneath the clavicle down into the heart. And then once they have it placed, they'll put the port on and they'll put the covering over it just to protect it and keep it sanitary. And then you go down and get an x-ray. So here at this point in time, like, I'm still throwing up very regularly, not holding anything down. And they're like, okay, you cannot throw up and you cannot move. So we're praying for a miracle.
Yeah, it's, you've just thrown up and you're looking at the rad tech going, okay, you have about 2 minutes. Let's get this done.
I'm like, okay, hurry. So I'm like laying there praying, like, please don't let me throw up. God, please don't let me throw up. Please protect me, God. And he gets it placed. And I'm like, can you pull this other one? Because it's starting to hurt. And he's like, no, not until we know this one is good. So we go get the x-ray and he looks at it and he's like, okay, you're just going to have to sit tight for a minute. Because what it had looked like is it had curved and had like a J tail on it. And he's like, we have to make sure that drops straight so that we don't have to pull it and rethread it. So he sent it to the radiologist. It was the most agonizing 15 minutes of my life while we waited. And I think I even threw up still again. And then the radiologist called back and said, it's good. You can send her home. It was just a reflection of something else, like the sternum or my spine or something. So they pulled my peripheral IV and they sent us home. And I think within a day or two of the PICC line, I started to stabilize. I wasn't throwing up as much. And as long as we were getting that Zofran done, so we would do Zofran in the bag in the morning. And then didn't we have to do one just straight into the port and then one in the bag at night?
Yeah, there was a lot of steps, I remember.
Oh, yeah, so many steps.
We went through a bazillion alcohol swabs and a bazillion
so many flushes.
Those flushes,
yeah,
so much.
Oh, that was insane.
So many things that I never wanted to know, but now I do.
For sure. So once we got through that, and they only want to leave that PICC line as long as they absolutely have to get you stabilized again, because there's such risk of it clotting over because it's a foreign body inside of you. So you have kind of an immune response to it, and it'll start to clot over and get what they call sludge in the bottom of it, which will make it hard for the nutrients and the fluids to get in. But then also, like, there's risk of infection. Like, one lady we know that had this condition, which I should have mentioned this before, was officially diagnosed at that 13-week place where they ordered home health for me, is hyperemesis guardivaria or something like that. Yeah. It just essentially means your body is throwing up excessively.
Yeah. So emesis is when you vomit.
Yeah.
And hyper means you are doing it a lot.
And I don't remember what the last one meant.
I don't remember that
We'll
either.
put it up on the screen so you can look it up if you want to. But after I stabilized, we started to learn just a little bit more about it, and that this condition happens in about 3% of pregnancies. It was a lot to take in and a lot to process because I'd never even heard of that before. Yeah. And I have some family members, not my immediate family members, that had severe nausea and vomiting during their pregnancies, but they would just keep working through it. And just for whatever reason, my body couldn't handle it. So after we get the PICC line pulled, we just stay in this routine of, like, within 30 minutes of waking up, I have to take an anti-nausea medication or I'm down and throwing up for the day. But we get it pretty well and I get stable and we're good.
Yeah, things got a lot better at that point, and it felt like they got better fast.
Yeah. Once we were stable, like, things just got to where we were in a solid routine to just manage it, which I was grateful.
I remember it wasn't too much later, we had a band trip.
Yeah.
And we went on the band trip with the IV pole and with a box of supplies, and we were doing this thing in the hotel rooms along the way, and all these band kids kind of adopted you. They had already adopted you anyway, and they were so excited for us to have a baby, but because they knew all the details, they saw what was going on.
Well, and you had to do room checks, so, like, here I am hooked up with an IV pole, just
walking down the hotel hallway.
Oh, that was crazy. I'd forgotten about that. Oh, man.
Well, it was that IV pole. It did fold up to a degree, but we had it on the bus with us, and kids are like, "What's this?" And so you're starting to tell the story a little bit to these high school kids. It was
well, and I like
crazy.
to remember that port was like hanging out of all of my sleeves, and I tried to keep a jacket on so that it was covered, and like you'd tuck it back up in a mesh sleeve that's over the top of it, but like it's bulky, and you're like,
yeah. So if there are any of our former band kids watching, sorry we traumatized you. Thank you for the support.
Right. But then we felt really solid through that time. So then once we get past all of this, we're stable. And then we get to like week 35, I start to go into labor. And I'm dilating and effacing really well. And we're at every week appointments with the doctor. And she would say every week, well, I'll see you next week unless I see you before then. And I think by week 38, I was at a 6, dilated to a 6 and like 75% effaced. Like I was almost there. And she just looked at me. She's like, I would have thought you had this baby already. She's like, are you done? You're ready to just have this baby? I was so done. It was like the end of July. So we're like, yeah, we want to have this baby. She's like, okay, next week we will call you and we will induce labor. She's like, we don't usually do that with first time births, but she's like, this has been a rough one. The baby is measuring really well. We'll just go ahead and get you started. So the next week we go in and they induce labor. And I was at a 6+ and like 95% effaced. Like kind of the whole idea of like, you sneeze, this baby's here. And we were an hour and a half in and I still like, I think I was at I just hadn't progressed much. So she checked me and my water broke. And then that's when it got real. Do you remember that? Then all of a sudden I went from being like conversational and all of that till I was like, oh my gosh.
Because we had been sitting in the hospital and we were like watching DVDs and chilling on the bed. And you've got this Pitocin drip going and it's like, man, this is kind of a cakewalk. I mean,
like, yeah, this is intense. Yeah. Everybody warned me this would be crazy.
And then it did get crazy.
And come to find out, just the way my body works, that had my water not broken, we'd never gone anywhere. We'd have just stayed in that state forever. Like,
yeah.
There wasn't enough pressure on my cervix to finish dilating. And it was not very long after my water broke. I was at a 7 and fully effaced, but I couldn't get through transition. So they came to me and I'd been working really hard and they said, Kay, we know that your plan was to go natural, but you also were open to an epidural. So they're like, our anesthesiologist is going into a C-section. So you need to decide right now, do you want an epidural or you're going to wait 90 minutes? And probably one of the funniest things of that whole birthing experience was I looked at you and I said, I have not enjoyed this birth or this pregnancy. This whole time I would at least like to enjoy the birth of my daughter. I'm getting the epidural. So we got the epidural. But I like, you know, that point in pain where you're like gonna totally lose it or you're still like managing it. I was right on that line and I was still managing it. So once they get that epidural placed and they give you the button, I was just like, one push, set it down. I'm like, okay, we're just gonna let it go, see what this does. Okay, 2 push like 15 minutes later, and it was enough to take the edge off, but I could still feel all the contractions. But I was like, okay, this is better. I can do this.
Well, that was the one piece of advice we got from our friend, my colleague at this school, because we were talking to him and we said, yeah, we think we want to go natural. And he's like, if I can offer you one piece of advice, get the epidural.
Right.
Yeah. And I think it ended up being the right choice.
I think it did too, because within 20 minutes, I was fully dilated to a 10, like complete. We were ready to push. So the nurse comes in with her assistant nurse, because we delivered at McCady Hospital in Ogden, Utah, the fantastic hospital, and it's a learning hospital. So like lots of people are in and out.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll get to that in a minute, but yeah, there were a lot of people in the room from time to time.
And so they're like, okay, we're going to walk you through how to push. I was like, great, I'm ready. Let's do this. And we started pushing and she's like, okay, let's do another one. And I think it was like 3 practice pushes. And then I was like, oh, it's time. We need to push. And she was like, okay, let's just keep going. And we pushed and we pushed and we pushed. And 2 hours later, my doctor shows up and she's like, what is going on? You should have delivered already.
It's so funny too. I remember her, and you mentioned earlier she was pretty matter of fact, but she was just like, all right, let's get this done. What's going on here? Come on, baby.
And essentially, they could see her crowning, but she was just hitting my pubic bone again and again and again. And I think it was just because as a first-time mom, my hips had not stretched far enough to accommodate her noggin. So my doctor, she was just really straightforward. She's like, okay, I don't do the vacuum because you can't get a really good seal and they slip and that's not going to work. She's like, so your 2 choices are you can have a C-section right now and there's no shame in that, or you can get 3 pushes with the forceps. She's like, but you only get 3. And then if she's not here, we go to a C-section. And again, I looked at you and said, I'm not paying for 2 births. Because in our birthing class, they had said, if you go for vaginal and then they have to do an emergency C-section, you pay for 2 births, 1 kid. And for whatever reason, that stuck with me.
Yeah, I think there was also just the element of, a complex surgical procedure. And once you have a C-section, then all future pregnancies are also going to be C-section.
They'll give you one shot your next one to do a VBAC.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so you do have the option to do that, and some people do. But I was so terrified of having to pay for 2 births. I just remember that was a sticking point for me. Like, that was terrible. And so I said, let's do the forceps. She's like, okay, your monitor is slipped, so you're going to have to tell us when the contractions are coming. Go ahead and relax for right now. We're going to get these set. So she got the forceps in, and seriously, big solid, like salad tongs like this. And she's like, okay, they're set. We're good. She's like, when you're ready. And so at this point in time, I think there was like 10 people in there. Like they had the neonatal nurses and staff to just grab her. And then my nurse was there. My nurse's helper was there. My doctor was there. You were there. Oh, I don't even know how many other people were there. I was you might as well sell tickets at this point.
you made that joke. Just who cares? Let's get it done.
I was like, let's get it done.
Anybody else out there that wants to see this happen? Come on.
Learning hospital, bring them in. Because you just don't care. At that point in time, it's like, get this baby here. And so I said, all right, here we go. So we did our first push. And she's like, almost there. You real good. Let's do another one. And I was like, hey, it's time. And so she came a little bit further and she's like, all right, people, this is our last push. She's almost here. And I remember I got half a push and she was out. And then I just remember they plopped her up on me. And we had said in our birthing plan that you did not want to cut the cord.
Yeah, I was a little squeamish about it, prior to the day.
And then she just looked at you and said, what?
Yeah, she said, here you go, Dad. Hands me the scissors. She goes, cut hard. It's tough. And, I had said I didn't want to do it, but in that moment, what am I supposed to do? So I'm like, okay, But in hindsight, I'm glad I did.
I'm glad you did too. Yeah. And then they just rushed her off to the corner, right?
Yeah, they had a weigh station, like a portable cart that had a scale and a light and some basic cleaning supplies for her, So they gave her like an initial bath and weighed her and all that stuff, made sure she was breathing well. And then they handed her to me.
I don't even remember her crying.
Oh, she did.
I was like, I hope she did.
Yeah, we talked about that beforehand. They said when a baby comes out, you want them good and mad. And she was. She screamed and wailed. And then they got her wrapped up nice and tight, got a cap on her. And then they handed her to me.
And so at this point, I'm just utterly exhausted. But then, of course, you have to deliver the afterbirth. So there was that going on. And then through the course of it, we learned that I had torn, which is really common. And if you don't tear, sometimes the doctor will do an episiotomy where they just do a little cut to try and help extend the opening to help get those babies here. But I had torn pretty significantly from my cervix all the way across the perineum. And I was really lucky that it didn't go into the rectum. Like, we were just really lucky that the tear stopped when it did. But I do remember my sweet doctor was trying to stitch up that tear before I closed up, and like everything started to contract back down. And she got a couple of stitches in, and I remember her dabbing a lot, and she's like, I'm just not liking this. And she looked at the nurse and said, we got to get this bleeding stopped before I can stitch it up. Grab the right angle retractor. So of course my feet are still up in the stirrups, and here's the nurse at my right leg holding me open with a right angle retractor. And that's about the last I remember, other than I threw up twice at that point. And then I just was laying there, and they had to boost my epidural. So I was still solidly numb, like had the edge off. But at that point, like for me, it seriously felt like a blink. Like, here was my baby. She had just gone over there, and then you were over there, and then this was happening. And then it didn't feel like very long to me at all. But
yeah,
you can shed more light on this part. That
was scary. It was such a wild emotional roller coaster, because here's my daughter. She's beautiful. She's perfect. The forceps had nicked her right above the eye, so one of her eyes was swollen shut. But she's beautiful, and she was pretty calm, me just holding her. And it's weird because you have the instinct to like bounce and sway. Like, I didn't expect that, but it just happened. But I was holding her, but then I'm watching them work on you, and the tone of voice and the tension in the room, like, that didn't go the way the doctor wanted it to go to stitch you up and get you ready. And so, I mean, it was intense for a little while. And after a while, one of the nurses came over to me and said, would you like me to take the baby? You've been holding her for a while. And I said, well, how long have I been holding her? And she said, about 45 minutes. And again, like you were mentioning, it kind of went by in a blink. I didn't realize that much time had passed. And so when I did hand the nurse this baby, my elbows were locked up. Like, I had to like really work to get my elbows back. But it was a weird little kind of out of time, again, surreal moment, because I did not know what was going on. And in reality, it's one of the most present moments I can remember in my life, because nothing else mattered. I had my wife, I had my daughter, wanted to make sure things were cool, and I was just going to be there and hold her as long as I had to. Well, as long as I got to. That's not weird. If I have to hold this baby, I will.
And I think, like, when I've heard you tell this story way back years ago, and occasionally off and on since then, I remember you saying, like, looking at what's happening and being a little bit shocked and asking, is that normal? I don't remember you asking that question, but I remember you telling it that way.
It's a little bit, it's not a fun mental image for me, because they did have a receptacle, a bucket essentially, that caught the afterbirth and any other fluids. And to me, it looked like a ton of blood. And I did ask, I'm like, is that a normal amount? And the nurse kind of gave me that sideways, like, man, the doctor's right here. I don't want to answer this question. But she's like, well, no, she's lost quite a bit of blood, but gave me the impression that this wasn't normal, that this was more blood than normal. And it looked like a ton to me. I mean, it was in the bottom of that bucket, it was inches deep. I mean, we're not talking millimeters. We're talking 2 to 3 inches deep of blood. And part of that, of course, is the natural afterbirth. But it was shocking to me. And again, the impression that I got from the nurse was like, yeah, it's just more than normal. This is concerning.
So, like, for me, I don't remember any of that happening. And then I do remember they came because they had to do the APGAR testing and the hearing test. And they do a couple of different breathing tests, right? And so they needed to, at the time, they didn't do that in the room. They took them back to the nursery to do that. And I remember you looked at me, you're standing on my left side, and you're like, what do you want me to do? Like, I was like, you stay with that baby. I was like, make sure our baby comes back. Yeah. Like, the strangest things I latched onto mentally then. Like, it's just crazy.
Which I feel bad about that, actually. Not bad. I mean, I'm super grateful that I got to go have those experiences. But here you are. You've suffered through this absolutely nasty pregnancy. You've had a tough and long labor. You've had complications getting stitched up afterwards. And here I am, get to go play with the kid and experience all the cool things. And they took and gave her a nice solid bath and put her hair in a mohawk and all that. And
took her picture.
And then I come back to the room, and one of the things that I remembered was you were still throwing up.
Yeah.
I mean, this is an hour plus after delivery, and you're still throwing up. And I remember you said something along the lines of, when does this stop?
Oh,
like, I've been throwing up for 10 months, essentially. When does this stop? And I was like, man, I don't know. And it took, I think it definitely tailed off, but it took 2 or 3 days before you started to be like, okay, I'm not feeling nauseous,
Yeah, that was pretty intense, because I do remember that. I think about the time you came back with the baby was about the time they were able to finally get me stitched up. And I don't think it was very long after that moment, because I remember my doctor and nurse were still there when you came back.
Right.
But I don't even know how long you were gone, but
it wasn't terribly long, like maybe 15 minutes, 20 at the most.
Yeah. And so I had solidly hemorrhaged for 45 minutes after giving birth. But then not too long after my nurse and my doctor left, and it was just the three of us, then the birthing nurse, the labor nurse, came in, and she's like, hey, we're gonna you're done in recovery, we're gonna take you now to your room. And it was during that I threw up another 2 or 3 times, and I was just like, that I remember asking, when does this stop?
When does this be over?
And so we were really fairly overwhelmed, so we sent our cute baby to the nursery. I was like, let's take advantage of that and let's get this stopped.
Well, we both just needed to sleep.
Yeah, and we did that night. Thank heavens, I finally fell asleep. And then the next day, every time, it was solidly into the next day when they pulled my catheter and had me start getting up to go to the bathroom because it had been so traumatic. But I remember I almost passed out, and this happened 2 times in a row. And so then they put me on bed rest in the hospital and said, if you need to get up to go to the bathroom, you have to call a nurse, and then we'll move you to the wheelchair, and we will take you the 6 feet to the bathroom and carry you from the wheelchair to the toilet. You can go to the bathroom, then we'll lift you and put you back in the wheelchair, and then we'll get you back to it was a big production.
Yeah, it was huge.
It was insane. And then when I was in bed, I had to be on oxygen, and then they tested my iron, and they came back and said I was borderline whether I needed a transfusion or not. And I don't remember what our thought process was with that at that point in time, but I remember we had mentioned to my parents that they were considering a transfusion, and they had given us the option. And my dad said when they came down to see our baby, it was several of my siblings and my parents, they said, we've talked, and there's a lot of us that have the same blood type as you, so if you need a transfusion, any number of us are willing to donate to help you. And in hindsight, I now look at that, and my dad being alarmed enough for them to have talked about that should have been a red flag in my mind that this is something we should do. But they gave us the option in the hospital, and we declined. And I said, well, if it's optional, I don't want it. I'm like, will it be a problem if I don't? They're like, no, you'll recover. You'll be fine. So we opted not to. And I think also in hindsight, looking back at that, if I had had that transfusion, my recovery would have been significantly faster, and I probably would have had a much higher immune response, because 1 week after I had an infection,
right,
like a UTI that we had to deal with, and that was pretty intense. So in hindsight, I wish we had gotten the transfusion, because my energy level was so low for weeks and weeks and weeks. I battled for 6 months, I think, before I started to have any kind of energy back from her, and I was on iron pills for 3 of those months, I think. So in hindsight, wishing that we had been educated about the pros and cons.
Right. Rather than, do you want this or not?
Yeah.
You can choose. Well, we don't know the ramifications. We don't know the implications.
Right. And I don't blame the doctors for that, because that should have been on us to ask that. Hey, walk us through the pros and cons of this. But we had such a strong emotional reaction that I think it was off-putting to those helping us.
Yeah, because it was scary. You know, we the only time you hear people talking about transfusions is in like the very most serious of cases, like this dude's been shot, he needs a blood transfusion, or this lady just lost her leg in a car accident, she needs a blood transfusion. And I think part of it was like subconsciously, if we don't get the transfusion, or if we don't have to have the transfusion, well, then it's not that serious. But if we do have the transfusion, wow, this is drastic and really, really major. And I think mentally we just didn't want to go to that place.
Right. Like, because to us, like, this was our first experience. This is like as normal as it gets. It's not normal. None of this whole thing was normal.
Yeah.
None of it was normal, nor was any of it common. Like, our experience is not a common experience. Like, and I think as we look at that, some of the major learnings that we have are first, that it created a lot of mental health struggles for us. Like, it was traumatic.
Oh my gosh, yeah, totally traumatic. And I didn't recognize that at the time. It was just kind of survival mode. Like, okay, we just have to get through this. We just have to get to the next step. We just have to get through it. You know, so yeah, there's definitely, I mean, for years, I didn't want to talk about any of it.
Yeah, no,
If
and
the subject,
anytime it came up.
Yeah. With anybody, I was just gone in the other room. All of a sudden, I have
and
to go.
Deflection. You would just deflect.
Yeah, I didn't want to talk about it. So, yeah, I mean, this conversation right now is cathartic for me. You know, our daughter is now almost 16, and I'm starting to be able to deal with getting her to the planet. So.
Right. Yeah, it was really a very traumatic experience, and we didn't really have time, because then you also have like all of the big changes that come with being first-time parents. Like, you've never done this before, and now you're responsible for caring for another human being and making sure they stay alive. So there wasn't really time to deal with and process that trauma. Like, we just kind of packed it in a little box and said, okay, someday we'll deal with that. Like, yeah. But we didn't even know we needed to deal with that. But then physically, like, there was all the mental health stuff they had to go through on top of like dealing with the mental health of being responsible for another human being and not sleeping and having jobs. Like, thank heavens you had 2 weeks, 3 weeks before you had to start school after she was here. But just looking at all of those things that we had gone through just took its toll. And so we were not prepared for what came next in the slightest. And then the physical trauma. Like, I wish that even just 6 weeks before we had given birth, somebody had looked at us and said, by the way, your body is about to go through one of the biggest traumatic changes that it's going to go through. Like, your body has been preparing for this. Like, all of your ligaments and your connective tissues have softened to stretch and allow for this to happen. But through the process of that, like, your pelvic floor muscles have stretched. Like, they're going to be looser and weaker, and like, you're going to want to consider doing some kind of physical therapy. Like, any other part of your body goes through something like that, it's recommended that you do some sort of physical training to regain proper use and function of that part of your body.
Some sort of formalized recovery program.
Right. Like, but not my doctor, not my nurse, not the pediatrician, not any of my friends who had given birth, not anybody that I know. There's not a single person who even planted a seed. I don't know how many people would have known to do that, but I know that at least in the world of medicine, there wasn't a single person who planted that seed, that there was something I should have done for my body to allow for better functionality and return to like strong core. Because a lot of times we see with childbirth, we start to get that pelvic tilt. Like, if you don't have it already, you definitely start to get that pelvic tilt after birth. And then a lot of women after going through childbirth will get a rib flare. So it's like your ribs are tilted back and your pelvis is tilted forward. So you get this S shape in your body and you compensate in all sorts of ways. And so you hear a lot of women talk about, like, after they have their first baby, if they laugh, they sneeze, they cough, they pee their pants. But that was something that was happening to me before, as mentioned in one of my other videos, but it was worse after having this first child. And it is so common that we just accept this as part of aging and part of becoming a mother. And what I have since learned is that couldn't be further from the truth. And if somebody had just planted a seed at that point in time, that you don't have to accept stress incontinence as part of your motherhood journey, like, things would be so different in the conversations that we're having. So I think the biggest takeaways I have from this story that can be applicable to anybody who's listening or watching this is that, first, when you make any kind of a medical plan going into a procedure, whether that's childbirth, surgery, recovery from an injury, anything like that, in your plan, have somebody set up who can help you remember to talk about pros and cons of decisions you have to make. When they present you with something, especially if it sounds scary, ask the first question, what are the pros and cons of this? Like, I think that would have saved us a lot of heartache as we dealt with the recovery.
Yeah, and one of the things we've talked about too is at these medical professionals, a lot of times it's like they don't know what you don't know. And sometimes they are dealing with the procedures and the situations and the diagnoses so frequently that there's a level of fluency that they have with those pros and cons that it's almost like, and again, I'm not faulting any of these medical professionals at all.
Not at all.
They're just doing their job. But I think they forget that not everybody knows what they're talking about. You know, it's that whole like, you got to talk to me like I'm 5. It's that concept because, you know, they might look at you and say, okay, here's the procedure. And in their brain, they're not even processing the pros and cons because it's moved beyond the consciousness level for them. It's just now part of what they do. But for you, you know, and again, that doctor may have maybe dealt with it 3,000 times or 300 times in their career, but you're only ever going to deal with it once.
Right.
You know, so you've got to have more information. And I think that's what you're talking about, is having kind of your reflex be to ask these kind of questions.
And to just really start with the pros and cons. Yeah. Like if there's only one question that you remember, ask, okay, walk me through the pros and cons of this.
Yeah.
What does this decision look like if I choose not to? What does it look like if I choose to? Mm-hmm. So I think that would be the first one. And then I think the second learning from this big time is there is both physical and mental trauma that comes with even routine procedures and routine experiences. And you need to take time to heal your mind and your body. And I think it's a safe question to ask. What is it that I should consider or that I'm not aware of that will help my physical recovery? And as you start to go down that line, you will uncover those mental blocks or mental challenges. You'll start to uncover those through that process. But I think asking that question of, what am I not considering?
Yeah.
What additional things can I consider?
I think another question we've asked too that isn't quite as technical, but if you look at that doctor and you say, okay, if I was your daughter, if I was your sister, if I was your mother, what would you want me to know before I make this decision?
Yeah.
Because they'll think about it differently.
And that's a question we've asked more and more frequently.
Yeah, and I think it was a doctor that actually told us that at some point, one of the surgeries or procedures, like, look, if you were my kid, this is what I would tell you.
Yeah. So I think those are the 3 big takeaways that I would take from this experience to apply forward. That if we had somebody with us that was helping us navigate that, if I could go back in time and look at, how old was I? 27-year-old MJ going through this experience for the very first time, I would say, okay, MJ, you need to ask what are the pros and cons at each of these junctures. And then also ask the doctor, if I were your daughter, your sister, your really close friend, what should I know before this happens. And we'll see that as a pattern that it took me a long time before I started consistently asking this in the next couple of stories that lead up to how my body got to where I am in my pelvic organ prolapse journey.
Yeah.
And then the other one is, what am I not considering that will aid in my recovery or preparation for this experience?
And you mentioned something a few minutes ago that like there's certain things that we go through in our medical journeys that we feel like are normal because they happen a lot. And you pointed out that there's a difference between something that's common and something that's normal. And so I think that's another possible thing that can happen to medical professionals is the common thing, the thing that they most often do may not actually be the thing that's best. It's just, maybe it's a quicker fix or it's a simpler fix, or maybe sometimes it's just cheaper. And so they say, well, this is what we normally do, and so here's an option. But I think that could be another potential question you ask is like, okay, for my long-term health, physically and mentally, what's the best choice? You know, take money out of the equation, take ease, take even speed out of the equation, unless it's an emergency situation, and just say, looking long-term, when I'm 75 years old, what's this decision going to have meant in my life?
Right. I think that's a really good thing to point out, because a lot of times, especially now in society, we are pushing to normalize things so that we reduce stigma. And I am all for that. We absolutely should normalize talking about things so that we remove that stigma, so that women are getting help. Because I think women's health is probably one of the most overlooked topics, concerns, issues that our society is facing right now.
Sure.
So I think like being able to look at that, and you may not be able to make that decision that allows you to have the best option, or the when you say take the money out of the decision, because there probably is a cheaper option. You may not be able to go with the most effective option just simply because taking the money out of the equation may not be what works for you.
Yeah, may not be realistic.
But having the information sets you up to know what additional things you should do given what you are going to do.
Yeah.
That's a lot of hypothetical around that.
Another thought that strikes me, though, around this conversation is, so we're both in our mid-40s. I'm older than you are. I'll own it. But I think our generation, and certainly the generation before, you know, in the course of human history, the medical technology that we have available to us now is a relatively new thing, right?
Yeah.
And so there's a mentality of, like, a pill will fix it, a shot will fix it, a surgery will fix it, the doctor will fix it. And I think in the 21st century, in the last especially 15 to 20 years, we're starting to realize that the medical solution may not actually be the very best solution, and it's worth it to at least ask the question. And so what I'm saying is that the medical profession maybe is slow to catch up to the idea that a patient, you know, is not going to just say, okay, doc, whatever you say, just fix me. You know, because then all of the onus is on the doctor at that point. Here's what I recommend. Here's what we're going to do. And I think part of what we're saying is take that responsibility as the patient. Take that responsibility back on yourself to learn a little bit, to be educated, to consider things, and use the doctor as a teammate rather than just the doctor as a button that you push to get rid of your problem.
I agree. Yeah, absolutely. And I think also we're starting to recognize, and I think doctors are too, because I've had several doctors in the last 10 years that have said, well, we can do this, but here is a more conservative approach that we can try first if you feel like you have the time that you're willing to work through it. So, and several times we have used those conservative approaches and it's been fantastic.
Yeah.
But then there's been other times where that conservative option is just not doing the trick. And so then we have to escalate through the steps.
And that's a balance too, because when you talk about money, if you've got 5 options from the most conservative to the most drastic, you're going to spend money and time on every single one of those.
Absolutely.
And so we've actually had doctors say to us, hey, look, let's try this conservative thing. I think that'll work. And if it doesn't, we're going to take the next step. We've also had doctors say to us, hey, based on what we're seeing, we can try this thing, but we're more likely going to end up doing this thing. And a lot of times they've been right.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. So as you are facing, not you, Keith, but you, the watcher, are facing whatever that medical experience is, or that transformation, or whatever it is that's part of your life journey right now, where you're just trying to think, I am so overwhelmed, I don't even know where to start. Start with the simple questions like, what are the pros and cons? Pros and cons it out. Like, we do that through a lot of the other big decisions that we do in our life, but sometimes we just skip past the medical and it's like, hey, just fix me. Just make this go away.
Yeah, just make it go away.
I'm done with this.
It's urgent. It's overwhelming, like you said.
Yeah. So start with the pros and cons. And even if the con is I have to continue living this way if we go a conservative route, at least you've thought through that much. Like, so start with the pros and cons, and then then the second question is, if I were your daughter, sister, best friend, what would you tell me to do? Yeah. What would you advise me to do?
Yeah. What should I know before I make this decision?
Yeah, absolutely. And then the third question is, what else should I know that will aid my recovery or long-term physical and mental health? If you start with just those three questions, that's going to lead you on your own journey of discovery and allow you to feel more empowered in that experience and allow you to show up more authentically as yourself because you feel ownership in it. Any other parting words?
Yeah, I just think this pause and reflect instinct is something you have to develop over time, because as humans, and I know just speaking for myself, I do get overwhelmed, and when you're under a lot of stress and pressure, you just want a quick solution. You want to press the easy button, And so I think when you hit that pause and reflect and you just simply ask the questions that you're talking about, I think psychologically and mentally, it's going to help put a little bit of space, a little bit of buffer between you and what's actually going on. Because there are true emergencies, like if you get shot and you're gushing blood, that is an emergency and you just got to do what you got to do. But most of what we go through, even in a pregnancy situation, or even in a broken bone situation or a sickness situation, it's not so urgent that you don't have time for a conversation, that you don't have time for some consideration. And I think it brings just the temperature down. It brings the urgency down to where you can be a little more thoughtful, even if you're miserable, even if you're vomiting your guts out, even if you're bleeding. Like, I think it's just a good practice to get into for absolutely everything. And as you ratchet down that urgency scale, you have a little bit more time and a little bit more freedom to discuss and explore other options as well.
As you're striving to show up as your most authentic self, take this for what it's worth. And again, we're not medical professionals. We're not legal professionals. We're not giving you any medical or legal advice. We're just simply stating from our experience, these are the things we wish we had known that helped us over time to show it more authentically. So maybe it'll help you or inspire you. If you've had an experience where you have learned something like this through a traumatic medical challenge or life challenge, share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, be you.